Can the folks online hear the room?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Good. We're
Okay,
recording
well,
and they can hear us.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to bring the meeting to order. My name is Santino Provenzano. I am the industry co-chair for the Management Consortium. This will be our final meeting for 2024. We've had a lot of folks coming in, just for the folks on the call, kind of filtering in late here, myself included, due to traffic this morning. But we'll go ahead and get started. If anybody comes in late, we'll give them an opportunity maybe at the end to acknowledge that they were here. So let's just go around the room really quickly. We'll start with the staff. Maya?
I'm Maya Burke. Administrative program.
Brandon Johnson was staying there.
Juanita Bernal, Pasco County, Stormwater.
City of Baltimore.
Drew Boylston, Dallas County Utilities.
Heather Maggio with the city of Tampa.
Jim Ivy with University of South Florida.
Sarah Napier, Charles County.
Knowles County.
Tampa.
Sorry, man.
Amanda Muni Morgan, USF.
ABC. Would you like me to run through the folks on the?
Yeah, if you could, online, yeah.
Gabriella.
Gabriella Bilter with Piney Point.
Blake.
Hi, Blake Simmons, Tampa Bay Estuary Program.
Megan Blanchard.
Hi, I'm Megan with Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council.
Sarah Kessler. Celeste Lyon.
Hi, Celeste Lyon, Resource Environmental Solutions.
Chris A.
Hey guys, Chris Anastasia, Swift Mud.
Emily Davis.
Hello, Emily Davis, City of Clearwater Public Utilities.
Emma Dantes.
Hi, I'm Emma Dantes with Pinellas County Environmental Management.
Heather Bryan. Kevin O'Donnell.
Hi, good morning. Kevin O'Donnell here, Florida DEP. We're in the watershed assessment and TMDL program.
Kira Barrera.
Taylor Barrera, City of St. Pete Water Resources Department.
Kira S.
Here's Roca with MacDill Air Force Base, Water Program Manager.
Molly. Nicole Maloney.
Good morning, Nicole Maloney with Pinellas County Environmental Management.
Someone listed as N. Yapple.
Hi, this is Noelle Yeakel with Duke Energy at Bartow Power Plant.
Peter Owens.
Hi, everyone. Peter Owens with Applied Sciences. Good morning.
Ben Rallis.
Hello, good morning. Ben Rallis, Florida DEP.
Resident. RJ. Roger. Ryan Rega.
Hey, this is Ryan with Florida DEP.
Ryan Reisig.
Brian Resnick, Pinellas County Environmental Management.
Steve Bartel.
Good morning, Steve Bartel with Stantec.
Sugandha,
Hi, this is Sugandha Shankar from FWC.
Vicky Parsons, Eric,
Hello. Hi, I'm Eric Searstead with Yara. Sorry, I'm a little late here.
you're fine, thank you for being here. Is there anyone I missed?
Elia Balcom Kennedy.
All right, let's go ahead and get to our agenda. Our first item for today is an update on the OTB similar capacity assessment with Sharon from Stantec. Good morning.
Like with multiple screen things.
Yeah.
Swap. What does it look like now?
Yeah, it's normal.
But stupid in the room.
I can fix it. You see now.
Thanks for bearing with us.
I shouldn't use this, right? I'm gonna just use the mouse. All right, good morning, everyone. I am here to present to you the third part of our task 2 report that we presented to as a follow-up to what we presented about 7 weeks ago. And this is a follow-up that is in response to comments and feedback on the draft report. Thank you all for providing comments and feedback. And specifically, it looks at outcomes if nitrogen were kept at 486 tons per year and what that may do to the system. So without further ado, here is our agenda for the day. The first 4 items were covered as part of the previous presentation 7 weeks ago. And what I will be bringing to your attention today will be the piece that we have added on to the work since, which is based on feedback, a new line of evidence, specifically using a model, a mechanistic model. So in the last 7 weeks, Steve Bartel, a modeler, has been busy working on developing this model from bottom up It is a mechanistic model, and today I'll be sharing with you some of our preliminary results. So in task 1, we updated the paradigm to better capture what was going on within the system. We looked at seasonal sub-segment targets in task 2, but today's focus will be on looking at reducing nitrogen loads in the system and how that may impact chlorophyll concentrations. So this is a table from the previous presentation as well. And today's presentation will be focused primarily on the total nitrogen threshold, specifically looking at the 486 tons per year. As a recap of what we presented the last time, we showed this figure and I just wanted to go over it briefly because it is the foundation of what it is that we're going to be doing moving forward. So on the left figure, you have the total nitrogen loads to Old Tampa Bay. And as you can see in the normalized loading, the values have been below the threshold since around 1995, but the absolute or the actual loads vary between years. And the reason is because the hydrologic loads to Old Tampa Bay vary depending on the year. The lines diverge on the left because the years with more hydrologic loading dilute the nitrogen. And so although the actual load is exceeded, the delivery rate is not. So once again, the focus will be on the recommendation that was provided in the task 2 draft report. That was the first recommendation of the 486 tons. And we have worked up a new line of evidence to assess whether 486 is the right path forward. And the model that we're using is called the CHASM model. It is a comprehensive aquatic systems model that was developed by Dr. Steve Bartel. And as you can see, it is a fairly complex model. It includes inputs both on the biological and environmental ends, and it includes as an input nutrient, specifically different nutrient species. The model itself puts out a number of outputs as well, and it varies from daily to community level. And it also puts out outputs of the nitrogen species as well as ecological risks. But the focus for this presentation will be basically the nitrogen inputs and then looking at the chlorophyll outputs. So the previous analyses showed that there was a relationship between nitrogen loading and chlorophyll, and including these ecological and physical and environmental parameters. What we hope to do is to shed light on the alternative management interventions and how they can, in concert with other measures, work to improve conditions in Old Tampa Bay. CHASM can model aquatic plant populations as well as fish and invertebrate biomass. So what we're hoping for this model to do ultimately when we have it more fully fleshed out is to shed light on the algae, seagrass, and oyster dynamics in the system. The integrated model focused on light and acres of seagrass, as well as habitat-related assessment of management of inverts and fish. The CHASM model actually complements this by growing seagrass, fish, and inverts over time with different nitrogen loading. The output that is generated by the system by the model is in grams of carbon, either on a per area basis or an area over daily basis. So the time increment for this model is on a daily basis. So CHASM is a model that has been used, and it is translatable from different areas and different systems. It's been around since the 80s. So it's a well-established model that has been used in many different applications around the world. For example, here on the left, you see that it's been used for the Mississippi River Gulf outlet model. And it was a fairly complex multi-year development of this model. It's been applied in the upper Mississippi River. It's been applied in the Patuxent River. So this model has been around and it is usable in different ecosystems where there is interest in whole-scale ecosystem dynamics. Who uses a chasm? Well, we have public sector clients using it, the latest being the South Florida Water Management District. Steve just finished a model for them for the stormwater treatment areas. The Army Corps of Engineers uses it quite widely. So does NOAA. Steve has also worked with private sector clients to help them understand what is the ecosystems that they manage. The model has been used not only in the States here, but also around the world. And the applications range from basic R&D to ecological risk assessment and to ecosystem restoration. So it's a model that's been widely published and widely used. All right, so how did we set up the chasm for Old Tampa Bay? Well, consistent with the previous efforts in task 2, what we did was we had the bay broken down into 6 segments, and the 6 segments were modeled independently. They're interconnected, but they're modeled independently. And EPC water quality data was used for select stations. We used representative food web components from literature. And we also use bioenergetics literature to be able to supplement the data that was not available locally. The period that was modeled was 2012 to 2021. And as you can see, the model has a lot of inputs and outputs. There is a little bit more complexity within the dotted line there and in some of these boxes. But the focus for this effort is looking at getting the inputs into the system and then looking at the phytoplankton chlorophyll that is generated as one of the outputs. So a little bit more detail about the chasm, because it is very complex. It took me a while to understand it as well. There are 30 different organismal components that are included in there. There are 12 plankton species, 2 algal types, 2 seagrasses, Pyrodinium cis, a bunch of primary consumers, secondary consumers, and all these values are then put into the system to see what comes out after 10, 20 years. In addition to just the population numbers that Steve has, he also puts in bioenergetics, so growth, reproduction, turnover, and also trophic interactions, who's eating what and how things are moving around. So all this very complex model pieces are then put in and you shake it and something magical happens and something comes out. Well, so the first run that we did was to look at holding the line. What would happen if 486 tons per year were maintained? In order to do that, Steve had to look at the historical loadings, basically taking the values of absolute nitrogen and then plugging that into the model as a base run. And then he did a second run where he looked at the nitrogen where it was kept consistent at 486. And then voila, we get some numbers. It's actually more complicated than that. It's produced in annual times, daily time stats for each subsegment, for each component of the ecosystem. And then he rolls it all up into one annualized number because that's our level of interest right now. We can delve deeper, but he rolls it into one number for the whole bay for the whole year. So he simulated these values for the Old Tampa Bay region from 2012 to 2021. And what we saw was a slight decline in chlorophyll in 2015, 2018, and 2019. So this is, I just want to remind folks, this is a draft run. We're still working on refining the model. The results, although not perfect, show that the model chlorophyll A, which is the orange line and the orange bar, does show a decline compared to the baseline run of the actual inputs. So this model outcome even though it shows a small shift, maybe all that is needed to bring the values of chlorophyll down such that we meet the target. So it may be a worthwhile endeavor looking at 486 as a future goal. So in getting those results, we looked at it a little bit further, or rather Steve did. And what we saw is that there were small chlorophyll declines, smaller than what I personally would have expected. And these declines may be caused by nitrogen accumulation in the sediment. So the nitrogen in the sediment, once you've run the model for a while, it increases and it stays high. The thought is that the chlorophyll concentrations and any declines that may be observed are being buffered by the fact that the nitrogen in the sediment is fluxing out into the water column. So this sediment diagenesis component, which came from the RCA model that Steve added on to his model, I think is a very critical piece of it, but it does not show a very large decline. It's just a small decline, and we think it's attributable to the nitrogen that's fluxing out as a consequence of there being more nitrogen. You end up having more chlorophyll. So these results are promising despite the small chlorophyll declines, and the plan is to evaluate complementary load reduction activities coupled with the different actions being proposed over time that will help result in nitrogen reduction and hence lead to a chlorophyll reduction. What are the next steps? Well, in the interim, what we're doing is calibrating and refining the chasm model. There are future model runs proposed, and one is to look at the projected load into the future out to 2031. The second is a reduction in lake tarpon discharge. And the third is with oyster restoration, what would happen to the system? Load reduction projects for task 3, which complements this work that we're doing, were due to Sherry Halster by November 22nd. And it would be great if we could get those projects entered in the system. These projects are needed to compare with entity compliance. So any help would be greatly appreciated. And with that, that is our preliminary update and draft run. And I'd be happy, as would be Steve, who's on the line, to answer any questions. Yes. Do you have a question? Oh, sorry. I thought I saw a hand wave. Santino.
Yes. Could you go back to the graph of the, yes, that one?
Yep.
So I'm understanding this right. You used historic information and the model to basically see how well, not how well, what the predicted kind of nitrogen and chlorophyll concentrations would have looked like at a 486, correct?
Correct. Yeah. First run.
Your model shows that at 486, you would have achieved some
slight
small, are those improvements or reduction in chlorophyll A values? Is that enough to get us to meet our management target for the Bay segment?
So this is a preliminary run. We're still refining it.
Drop by 1 microgram per liter. Currently, small range average.
So some of the years, yes, like that when we're really super close, most of the time. You have to bleed it off the sediments, kind of like what we talked, like what we've seen in Hillsborough Bay. It's kind of like need that time where you turn off the faucet and you let it bleed out from the sediments before you start to see like bigger kinds of changes in what you expect to see in the chlorophyll concentration.
All from preliminary results.
Very
Understood.
preliminary.
And you're reading my mind. I think what would be helpful to see, because going from a hydrologically adjusted load to an absolute load is going to mean we have to do things at facilities, right? And projects. It would be good to see this when you get there coupled with that longer term view of past, present, future to say, okay, here's what you get out of going to that absolute load? And is the juice worth the squeeze, right? If this is what we see over long term and we're still gonna continue to have periodic non-compliance, then maybe this isn't the right management. Right? That's kind of what I was getting at. Okay.
So this, correct me if I'm wrong, this is option one and maybe that you're moving is correct? It's 4, 2, 3, or 4.
This first model run was to respond to some of the comments that several NMC reviewers put forward, which is to say, we would like to see more evidence that shows how the system would respond to 486.
So it's 1.
That's what this run is evaluating.
It's, we haven't evaluated 2, 3, or 4 yet.
Yeah, 2, 3, or 4 mainly in evaluating compliance with loading conditions and how you would adjust those loading conditions relative to different hydrologic regimes. That doesn't really necessitate a model run for those different ways to assess compliance.
Okay.
This is mainly, like Maya said, in response to questioning whether or not 486 still holds water on maintaining chlorofluoric conditions.
I think Chris had his hand up.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question and then I think I got an answer, but now I have a new question. So I would like to just, first of all, this is really cool stuff. I'm very, very excited about kind of, drilling down into some of this work. I am somewhat familiar with this model from some of the work I did back in the day in Louisiana with LSU and looking at some of the dynamics in the Mississippi River Delta. So this is really cool stuff. I am very, very much interested in the slide that you presented that shows, I think that was like slide 15, that shows that sediment nitrogen accumulation. I think you're right on target with this slide. I think this tells us the story. And you guys already kind of talked about this, so I'm not going to rehash it. This idea of a legacy load and estimating a time. Let's say you were to cut off all your nitrogen load from the surface. What would be that time frame when we would start to see that legacy load be exacerbated or used up? I think that's a fundamental question. You guys already talked about that. One of the things though that I'm curious about is if you go back to that other figure, 14, yeah, that one. So when I look at this, and I understand this is old Tampa Bay wide, all the subregions combined. To me, what that figure tells me is there's not a whole lot of difference between what the actual data, the 2012 to 2021 loadings look like, and what it would look like had we maintained 486 tons per year. Having said that, and I'm sure you guys are going to do this, but if you start to tease this apart by subregion, specifically going back to the idea of that legacy load of nitrogen, the Northwest region and basically the west side of Old Tampa Bay tends to be a lot more rich in organic stuff than the east. And I'm curious, if you were to run this just looking at each subregion, could we potentially focus some targeted management activities to those subregions that we know have the greater legacy load of nitrogen? And I know that there's been some work too to suggest that that those are the areas that typically house the pyridinium cysts in the off season, is that more organic rich. So I guess my question is, do you think there's value in really focusing on those parts of Old Tampa Bay where we have the highest organic accumulation, Safety Harbor, the northwest side of Old Tampa Bay, and whether or not maybe looking at targeting those areas might get us to where we want to go quicker?
I think that's part of what task 3 is about. And sort of once we, have confidence that 486 is the right number or still good enough, the still good enough number, then we would look at sort of the kinds of management actions that you all would be committing to implement over, the upcoming RA cycle or cycles, and where you would get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of improvements that we're looking for. So I think I know all these things are like kind of complicated and interconnected, but that's, I think, why Sharon is asking and reminding everyone that like we're assessing this based off of the load reduction projects that you've already submitted. And then that you're telling us that you're committed to in the future. So we can sort of see like how much progress is already baked in. And then how much needs to be done and where you might want to focus that effort so that you're not just sort of, feeling pressure to spend money everywhere for not a lot of return, or, like that's what we're trying to get. That's the place we're trying to get to, but we'll need more information to sort of run those subsequent analyses.
Okay, just a quick point. I do understand that this is very preliminary. Has there been have y'all done a comparison of the model results for the existing conditions to the actual observed chlorophyll in Old Tampa Bay for those years? Just so we get an idea, should we start doing comparisons between two different scenarios here? Trusting that the model is appropriately predicting chlorophyll concentrations? Or is this something we should wait on until we know the model is working correctly for observed conditions?
So yeah, this is very preliminary.
Yeah.
Put
Steve to get the progress
Grindstone on this. He's been working very hard.
I'm sure.
These results.
Of all people, I know.
You know how hard it is.
I know.
And so what this is showing is a scenario run. And it's not showing you how well the model actually reflects reality.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying. And that is, we're still working on this. And so we wanted to have some results to show that we are being responsive to requests.
Sure.
Additional.
Understand.
This is what this is providing. So the fact that we do see a reduction with this scenario run, to me, is somewhat suggesting that the model is predicting reality. But we are doing, Steve is going back and sort of revising the parameters, recalibrating the model to make sure that it does reflect reality. I'm not suggesting that it's not reflecting reality.
Sure.
It's just that there's more work to be done, and I wouldn't be surprised that when it is fully calibrated, we are going to provide that assessment. Does it reflect reality?
We'll make sure we didn't get the cart ahead of the horse.
Correct. I hear what you're saying. That was one of the concerns I had.
That was my question too about the calibration process.
Yes.
He's working on it, yeah.
That's what he's in the middle of too. Like, we certainly all recognize that that's the quota. We wanted to look, as they described, this is in response. We wanted to provide this additional line of evidence. We realized that's kind of the big out of the task 2 report that became the headline recommendation, right? So we wanted to explore that. And so what we saw with some of these preliminary results was, okay, so the 486 mentioned did show some reduction. It's not this giant silver bullet reduction, right? But we tried, and that's what part of the process of digging in, looking at the sediments and some of those other parameters. As Maya said, there's that component of, especially with the sediment diagenesis and the contribution of internal loads, that if you have, you model out and you maintain, the inputs, then that there's a source for that sediment to continue to load that. So what happens further out? Where does that in that sediment graph show that, that kind of okay, once the tap is I love that scenario turned off, and those the contribution from the sediment starts to bleed down. Where does that go? So that's it's a marginal, but minor difference. We did see that difference, and at least in my mind, my very rudimentary understanding of the modeling process there. But that shows that okay, so the 486 is not, I don't want to say effective, but it's a pathway that came to look at. Again, that's all part of that plan. As I mentioned, we want to plug in those interventions where Earth.
I'm gonna have to second Chris A's too, that I think analyzing the subsegments for the north and east side, east and west side, north side of Old Tampa Bay needs to be done. We need to zero in even further for legacy sediments. I'm gonna second Chris A's. There is value in analyzing those
Yeah, I think
at that level.
in the 6 sub-models, we were able to partition out how well models are performing to the subsegment. I think, all the discussion we're having is the better part of my career. In the early 2000s, we've been talking about conditions in Old Tampa Bay. We've known it's been sort of this marginal bay segment that has elicited some positive egress response, but as of lately, it's not responding to nutrient loads in the way that we think it should, if we're just considering hydrologically normalized loads. So we're here today because we know we need to do something. What that something is still, we're still, turning the screws on exactly what those numbers ought to be. But going back to original management targets, 486 is this sort of incremental step of seeing what the response to the system should be. And there's a huge question on the time scale of the response, even if we ratchet it back to that 486 number. It's not something that's probably going to happen in the next year in terms of getting to a chlorophyll criteria. Just going to 486 is probably going to be a 5-10 year process, especially if the modeling results, we don't have any empirical data to suggest it. But we recognize that this internal pool of nutrients needs to be bled out of the system for there to be longer term chlorophyll reductions observed on a year-to-year basis. We got to get there through reduction of external loads. That's probably the most practical pathway. We could talk about other sort of management approaches, but it's putting a Band-Aid on it, not really fixing the true source of the issue. We're wading into the system and the accumulation of nutrient pool in Old Tampa Bay. And that's what we're trying to develop, these different lines of evidence, these different tools. We have some existing tools already that we've used in the past. And we got to converge on an answer, I think, over the next 5-10 year RA period to present to DEP that this is the path forward. This is what we think as consortium participants is a rational path forward that will get us to meet water quality conditions and more consistently than we currently are now. The one thing that Sharon mentioned, sort of the future work, we're also going to be taking a look at what it means to the system if we just maintain the current trend we're on in terms of nutrient loads. The hydrology has changed a whole bunch. Look at those sort of incremental increases that we can extract from the empirical data. Look at the temperature increases that we're experiencing in that system, the differences in salinity conditions, and see what the response of Old Tampa Bay in the future is going to be to those future conditions. It's probably not going to be much. It's probably going to be much more grim. And using those results, would suggest that some incremental way of ratcheting down what we have control of these external nutrient loads is probably the path we need to be on. It's just a matter of what that number ultimately should be amongst the consortium participants representing that space. So that's sort of my rationale and sort of the train of thought we're moving in. Again, these are all baby steps. I think at this point, a lot of preliminary tools, but we're trying to build this sort of evidence to present to y'all, get your reactions, and move forward as a whole to better manage the system.
Yeah, I think that that kind of do nothing analysis, just to show everybody what the future can look like if we don't take action, is going to be a really important thing to see. We start to make decisions about, and hard decisions about additional management actions. And in my mind, I'm always thinking on the regulatory side because that's my job. It's like, how do I satisfy EPA, DEP that we are moving along the direction? And your point about if you turn the faucet off or turn it down, I think is a better way to say that, Maya, because we're not going to turn it off. Having some forecast of how those management actions will eventually get us to a place on sediments where we're starting to eat up or use up that bank of nutrients. And ultimately that will translate into a slow, but maybe hopefully predictable improvement of play. is where we ultimately want to land. So I know you guys weren't ready today at Stantec I think the calibration piece is an important component before we start making decisions of, you know, is an absolute 486 the right management target? We're gonna need to see that as a group and stack hands that we believe, right?
Yeah, it's all taking, I think, longer than we had hoped, but we're trying to involve you all along the way, so you can kind of grapple with it in bite-sized pieces and think about, you know, where you can find the will to act on something that we all can get behind, right? There are two questions online. One is from Carrie Lopez. She is happy to see priority assists are being included in the CASM model, and she wonders if you can tell us how they're modeled, like what aspect of sys dynamics are being modeled.
Yes, right now the cysts are in there entirely as a placeholder. They're carbon values, and I'm anticipating to use the model the dynamics of cyst generation and cyst germination as they contribute to the model population dynamics based a lot on Carrie and her colleagues' work. So, you know, don't be surprised, Carrie, if I reach out to you for some help in this area. But right now they're just in there as a placeholder.
Okay.
And then yeah.
Yeah, just you know, I think just to add to the comments about nitrogen and sediments, and you know, one thing that's important to know is that the cysts themselves, you know, while they're providing a seed stock for pyridinium blooms in the sediments, they're also a nutrient reservoir because they have, you know, their nutrients, their nitrogen, and everything they need to germinate inside. So just another kind of aspect to consider.
Right. Thank you. And like I said, don't be surprised if I reach out to you. And the second question from Chris, essentially, what I've done.
Steve, I'm gonna just state the question so everybody.
Oh yeah,
knows.
sure, yeah.
Where do the literature values of sediment nutrient flux come from? Do they build on previous work like Paul Carlson and Laurie Yarbrough and Ken Yates? There you go.
Yeah, you know, just for expediency and trying, you know, exploring to see whether or not it would be possible to, you know, undertake this activity at all, I essentially took the nitrogen diagenesis model directly out of the RCA model that was developed as part of the integrated model, and currently using their values for concentrations and flux. So, and that's one of the challenges, because as you're probably aware, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of modeling sediment nutrient dynamics. We did have the advantage in that it was mentioned that we recently completed work for the South Florida Water Management District, and that was really focusing on phosphorus. And as a result of that, CASM accumulated a very detailed phosphorus sediment diagenesis model, which I've been, you know, kept in this version. And so then it's just the addition of the nitrogen diagenesis model from the RCA. So those are a component that had not previously existed in CASM applications, which focused more on water column dynamics. But so we're working through that. And the question is, you know, are we getting realistic, accurate characterization of sediment nitrogen dynamics? Because if we're overestimating the flux from the sediments, then that's going to mask, at least in part, mask the implications of reducing external loads. Regardless, in the current model construct, and essentially the same thing was in the integrated RCA model, is that loads are coming into the system in forms that are not directly used by the plants, as you're probably aware. So regardless if it's nitrogen dynamics in the water column or the sediments, likely the combination of both, it's introducing some time lag between the loading of nitrates and the manifestation of that as chlorophyll. And also, I'll just back up a little bit, even though, you know, it's the basic thrust here is to try and see if we can develop the system from the bottom up, as it were, by constructing this fairly complex representative food web, to see if we generate relationships between loading and chlorophyll that we saw in the empirical analysis that Miles had put together. And so that's part of the motivation. In addition to developing a tool, as Sharon indicated, we can also look at the potential implications of other management interventions, like changes in like tarpon flows or bumping up oyster dynamics, because they're directly modeled in the system. And where and again, I see this as entirely a complementary activity, where the integrated model focused on predicting underwater light availability and overlaying that with the distribution of seagrass. Chasm actually models the growth of seagrass based, and again, it's borrowing from models of seagrass production dynamics, Harwell et al., things that have been in the literature for quite some time. And we also extend beyond the habitat oriented ecological benefits for invertebrates and fish that were generated by the integrated model to actually try and look at changes in production dynamics for some of, just a couple of representative finfish and then associated invertebrates. So those are some additional capabilities. But again, the chlorophyll results in these very preliminary simulations showed the highest subsegment concentrations were in the central west and central east. The lowest were in the southwest and southeast, with the northwest and northeast being sort of in between. So it seems to be representing some of the spatial chlorophyll results that we saw in Miles' empirical analysis. But again, it's not an easy activity. I'm trying to plow forward as quickly as I can to determine is this going to be useful at all, which I from the preliminary results I'm at least modestly encouraged, but there's a good bit of work to be done, and I'm going forward as best I can.
Chris A., what do you got?
Yeah, so Steve, thanks for that explanation. That's really a great answer to the question. So I appreciate that. The one thing I just had a kind of a little bit of a follow-up when you're talking about the nitrogen diagenesis model from the integrated water quality model that was done a few years back.
Right.
Does that also look holistically at other macro and micronutrients, for example, iron? And we've done work in our spring systems with Matt Cohen at University of Florida, and there's the flux of iron from these clay sediments we think is having a perhaps even more of an impact on algal accumulation in places like the lower part of Rainbow River than even nitrate does. And so I'm just wondering if, like in this model construct, are you looking at other nutrient sources that could also affect the productivity up the chain?
Yeah, very good question. At the moment, it just looks at nitrogen and phosphorus.
Okay.
Yeah, if you have literature that you can send, I certainly would be happy to take a look at it. But again, at this point, adding additional complexity would be a challenge. But
yeah. I'll send you the paper. Dr. Madison Trowbridge is my colleague at the district. Just recently published work with Matt Cohen on this in the Rainbow. Now I understand, that's a freshwater spring system, and we haven't really applied this much in estuarine environments. So maybe way too soon to even think about that in this model. But I'll send you the reference anyway, so you can take a look at it.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'll look forward to seeing that.
So as you all can see, Steve's been living and breathing this model, and mentally I think of it as like a bicycle, e-bike, whatever your favorite mechanical tool is, and he's putting all these screws in, right? And he's putting all these connective pieces in there, and then he hits run, and hopefully it runs and doesn't come to a crashing and grinding halt. But so that's how I conceptualize it in my simple brain here. But yeah, it's a lot of complexity that goes behind zooplankton, seagrass, finfish, each one of these boxes that's shown.
Are there any other questions? Well, thank you. We appreciate the update. Let's go ahead and move on to B on the agenda, which is a discussion of a draft decision memo on the ability of absolute load SANNC.
Yeah, this is all probably very much premature. We're not asking you to make a decision at this point right now. But mostly this is going to be an education process for some of the newer consortium participants on how we arrive at certain decision points. Why is this mouse not moving? There it is. You guys see it now? Okay. So before I jump into the decision memo, like I said, we're kind of using this time to educate consortium participants about major decisions that have been made by the consortium in the past. If you go to our website, tbep.org, and you go to the consortium page, so I'll navigate there. So tbep.org, you go to boards and committees, nitrogen management consortium. All the legacy documents, the history of the consortium is we attempted to document on this website. And in prior RA periods, we've had some key decision points that had to be made, and we had to reach consensus to the consortium. There's actually, I think, over 30 decision memos that have been developed. And I looked at it, the last one we actually did was back in 7 years ago, 2017. So there's a lot of new faces in the room that haven't gone through this sort of consensus building process, but this is one of the ways that we try to achieve that. If you go to that decision memo sidebar, you can see all the ones that were developed. And we use this as a vehicle to reach consensus internally amongst the consortium participants, but then ultimately to get some feedback from the regulatory bodies that that we're responding to in developing these reasonable assurance documents. So there's usually a request for concurrence or some sort of response from DEP and EPA as we come to these decision points as a consortium body. So as I mentioned, this last one in 2017 was relative to Hillsborough Bay. There was a reserved allocation that still remains in Hillsborough Bay. And we came to consensus that it should remain reserved as a buffer to meet chlorophyll A targets in that bay segment in the future. There are a number of different open items that still remain that we've been talking about over the past couple RA cycles that we haven't developed a full decision memo and forwarded that on to the regulators for feedback. But, that was the last one that we did. So as we move through this process of understanding what we should be doing in Old Tampa Bay, we have developed a draft decision memo based on some of the work that Stantec has done. I'm not saying that it's ready for a vote, but this is sort of the style of the way we've developed these decision memos. And just to walk you through what this draft decision memo is it's kind of reflecting on what the current numeric nutrient criteria are and have been adopted for each of the bay segments, and particularly calling out Old Tampa Bay. So this first sort of section just gives that background, and there's a table in there kind of pointing to and highlighting what we're talking about in this RA cycle as potentially updating or recommending for changes to DEP and EPA. It's that yellow bar there at the top relevant to Old Tampa Bay. So what has been proposed so far is to banning sort of that hydrologic normalization process of looking at delivery ratio of nitrogen to the Old Tampa Bay system and using an absolute loading target. So as I mentioned, the current numeric nutrient criteria for which that bay segment is assessed on an annual basis by DEP is chlorophyll A as an annual average and a total nitrogen delivery ratio as well as the total phosphorus delivery ratio. And I think some of the graphics that have been shown and they're expressed in this decision memo show that there's that disconnect that we're continuing to trend down. If we look at hydrologically normalized loads, the absolute loads are trending up, and we're inconsistently meeting chlorophyll A conditions in that bay segment. So that's the whole rationale of why we're here, we're kind of talking about this work and the steps forward that are needed in Old Tampa Bay. If we move to an absolute load recommendation, it changes how compliance would be assessed in the future. It would get away from that delivery ratio and look at the absolute loads, which we know are very much subject to the annual hydrologic conditions in the watershed in any given year. Some of the preliminary analysis that were contained in the Task 2 report suggests, though, that if we look at those absolute loads, that there's a higher propensity or a higher probability that we'd meet the current chlorophyll threshold, the numeric nutrient criteria for Old Tampa Bay. Hopefully some of the modeling work will continue to build lines of evidence that if we ratchet down on external loads, that there's a greater propensity that we'll continue to meet those chlorophyll conditions in the future. Timescales are certainly something that we need to take a look at and are a question in our minds as staff on how quickly we can meet those just looking at external loads. And that's why these other management interventions are also part of the mix of looking at reducing hydrologic inputs from Lake Tarpon Canal, oyster restoration, and I think continue to talk about how we could improve tidal circulation in that bay segment, working with FDOT. So we can't look at those empirically alone. We have to develop these other tools, these mechanistic tools to answer those questions, especially if a bunch of different actions are implemented at once. And that's certainly some of the work that we're anticipating to do over the next 2 to 3 months. But ultimately, we did have a conversation with DEP preliminary back in November. I think Ben and Kevin are online, as well as other DEP folks. So, we kind of presented this idea. If we went away from looking at a delivery ratio and looked at an absolute load, would that be acceptable as a numeric nutrient criteria for the space segment? They, provided some information that there are other parts of the states where TMDL or a load has been adopted as a numeric nutrient criteria. So it's not something that's totally off the shelf. It doesn't have to be concentration-based criteria, which a lot of those criteria throughout the state are expressed as. So if we went this direction, if this ultimately becomes the recommendation, it seems like, it would be acceptable to DEP. There are, I think there were questions at the last consortium meeting of how that would impact some of the final orders and QBELs that have been adopted back in the 2010 period when we developed allocations for all the partners in the consortium. Their feeling was that there would be another secretarial order that would need to be adopted to adopt those recommended changes. So it's not a trivial task to go through and get secretarial order adopted, but they did not see that as sort of a barrier that couldn't be achieved by the administration, especially if it's formulated from the consensus and there's consensus on moving forward on that's the right thing to do for this bay segment. So again, this is draft, read it, provide some comments, but until we continue to build some more evidence around that 486 numbers, we're not going to send this to DEP. This is again, mostly for your information, kind of understanding the process that we've gone through in the past as consortium participants and get your feedback initially on sort of this direction. So I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions, want to boil down into the document. But again, this is sort of the style of what the decision would represent. And there would be a baby step decision ultimately that we'd probably want to forward on to the DEP and EPA, get feedback, and then ultimately feed into the addendum that we're going to develop as part of this RA process and formally submit to DEP. And our hope and timeframe was early in 2025. Based on sort of the trajectory of work, it's probably going to be later in 2025, but we're still trying to push ahead as quickly as possible. So I'll stop there. Any questions, reactions, comments, input?
I'll make a comment.
Yeah.
And I'll embed this in my overall comments, but I mean, right at the start, I'd like to see the title of the document specifically reference Old Tampa Bay. To make it very clear that we are proposing potentially this change, a management tool for that segment.
Right now, we have the title of updating the Old Tampa Bay estuarine numeric nutrient criteria.
Okay, so I was looking at what you had on the agenda, not on the title here. I think that probably addresses it.
We don't have that.
Want to make sure we don't get on that slippery slope.
Is there a specific time frame you want us to review this by?
It'll probably be before the next meeting, which we haven't scheduled yet, but I think we're looking before, I'm gonna say end of January, early February, so you're, okay. All good, end of February.
Pick a different date, but the way the board meeting shook out,
Yeah.
the date that we had picked.
So there's gonna be time to review.
Okay.
Yeah. And provide comment. Right now, it's a Google Doc linked in the agenda, and we welcome any comments to it.
It's like hard to answer that question because we are looking to get this work wrapped up into an addendum, but it's really important to us that we have consensus, so we can only move at the speed of trust. So it's kind of on you guys to let us know like how long you're gonna need to weigh in.
Is it fair though to say that I'm looking at the proposed meeting schedule? The next one would be in February. I assume Stantec would come back in February with an update on their calibration work. The group is probably going to need to see that before we can formulate a final opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, yes. That's why I say we're not asking for a vote today.
And this is just a proposed meeting schedule. I scheduled a lot more meetings at the end of this year and over the course of this year to try and give us time to talk through all of these issues. And we might need more at some point in the year next year, but I don't really like to call these just for like, if it's just about like, these are the water quality conditions, we need to submit an annual compliance assessment report. I haven't heard from you all that like 2 meetings a year frequency doesn't work for you. So I'm interested in your feedback of like how often and when. None of this is in stone yet.
And just one last comment, on this sort of baby step approach, the 486, not abandoning the 486 means that allocations would effectively remain the same. It's how those allocations would be evaluated for compliance if we had to go that route with multiple years of chlorofluoride exceedances. So that's really sort of the ramifications. We've held meetings with individual entities. We have a couple more scheduled for folks within the basin in the new year, just to show what those changes might mean for them in terms of permitted loads and the allocations that are currently represented in their permits. And it's not good if we've been in hydrologically normalization, but it's sort of the reality, like I talked about before, of where we're at in that base segment. We know something needs to be done. We've always been leveraging hard on reducing nutrients no matter the source to continue to get the bay back on track. This bay segment remains not on track. We're expecting similar seagrass results of it not being on track and losing seagrass again. Those are forthcoming probably in the new year from the Water Management District. So we know we need to do something. This is an incremental step that we think is approachable to the consortium participants. It's a matter of how we get there and show how we're going to get there in the future with the different management interventions that we know you guys already are investing in, and how that might reflect in terms of meeting an allocation in the future. And that's where some of these tools will hopefully assist in making that assessment more clear to each of the participants and representing the room. So that's my spiel for today. Any comments or anything? We'll have some, I think we now have some actually better news.
All right, if there's nothing online, then we'll move on to the next agenda item, number 3, which is 2027 reasonable assurance update with Marcus kicking it off.
All right, y'all, you're gonna like this. This is not model data. This is real data right here. Let's, yeah, some averages, yeah. Yeah, let me do full screen. So about this time every year, I give an update on water quality results for the year. It is provisional at this time. I give a similar presentation to our boards early 2025 or early start of the year, where we do have complete data for the previous year. So this is provisional in the sense that I don't have water quality data through December. That's still being processed. I have provisional. Well, I have QC data through October, non-QC data with November that I got yesterday. So I do have 11 of the 12 months for this year. And you'll get a sense of how we're shaping up for water quality in Old Tampa Bay, as well as the Bay as a whole. So I'm going to assume that everybody understands this flow chart here. This is our process for assessing basically compliance within the NMC. This is done every year. We assess attainment of water quality thresholds at the Bay segment level. We report that every year to DEP, and then that becomes part of the overall 5-year RA assessment report that we're currently in right now. We're in year 3 of the current period. And so basically the whole reason why we have this assimilative capacity project for Old Tampa Bay is because we ended up, I think, around item 3 on the right there during the last RA period, where we had consecutive years of not attaining the threshold in Old Tampa Bay. So that's kind of how we funneled out in this process and why we had to take action to initiate that project. And so the report I'm doing today is basically part of this framework where I'm just reporting back to you how we've done with water quality. So lots of figures coming your way. This is just showing you basically where we're at with chlorophyll trends for each of the major Bay segments. Old Tampa Bay, top left; Hillsborough, top right; Middle Tampa Bay, lower left; Lower Tampa Bay, lower right. I guess the take-home story from today is, we're coming off of basically a few years where we had really dry conditions and really good water quality Bay-wide. The exception being, as you all know, the storms that came through this year that really kind of fouled a lot of things up for water quality. And you'll notice every single Bay segment, you see a jump up in chlorophyll A, which is largely a result of all of the water coming in from the storms, the stormwater loads. And as I show you the seasonal trends, you'll see how that sort of played out month by month. And so same setup here, Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough, middle and lower. Water quality is looking good. This is just 2024 here, shown in red. The box plots and points are basically all the other years back to 1975. You can see that, the story basically leading up to around essentially September, October, August, with Debbie, water quality is pretty good. It's pretty much below the long-term median until we started seeing those storms coming in. And then we started seeing chlorophyll jump up to pretty abnormally high levels for most of the Bay segments. To show you what it looks like for October alone when we saw the storms. I think November would have a similar picture, but these are the actual concentrations of chlorophyll at the stations that are monitored by EPC. And we see some really high numbers in some places. Like we were talking about the western edge or the western side of Old Tampa Bay. Here we have plus 70 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll in October alone. I also want to talk about light attenuation. So when we talk about our management framework as a program, what we're trying to do through the consortium, we consider, the chain of basically nutrients to light attenuation to seagrass. So looking at just chlorophyll is only part of the picture. How that manifests to the light environment in the water column and what that means for the ability of seagrasses to grow, we also want to look at light attenuation. More nutrient loads, more chlorophyll, more light attenuation is pretty much the relationship you expect. And it's kind of a more interesting story, I think. This sort of surprised me here. Old Tampa Bay, over the last almost 10 years or so, we kept seeing light attenuation increasing, almost breaching the target here. But last year and the previous year, and what really surprised me is last year, light attenuation continued to decline on average. This is the annual average, which I was sort of confused by, not really sure what's going on there. But the other base segments do tell that story of increasing chlorophyll concentration, higher light attenuation as a function of the storms. You see a jump up in Middle Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, and Lower Tampa Bay is actually this year above the threshold for light attenuation, which as you'll see, sort of translated to a change in the management outcome for that base segment, which I'll show with the report card. Here's the seasonal light attenuation. Not much of an interesting story compared to chlorophyll, but again, you kind of see that typical seasonal pattern and then sort of some jump ups in light attenuation as the storm started coming through later this year. And here's the same thing, just looking at October only for the EPC stations, looking at light attenuation. And actually, interestingly, Old Tampa Bay here, even though the overall average was below the light attenuation target, you do see some stations that are above that target. I think it's 0.83 per meter. So you do see some relatively high values in October in the northwestern part of the bay. Okay, so I wanted to start with just the raw data, or rather the trends and plots, to kind of give you an idea of what we've seen in the context of long-term patterns, as well as just like I said, the last 2 years, we had really dry conditions, and I think that sort of translated to what we're going to see this year for the regulatory outcomes and the management outcomes. So keep that in mind. We're coming off basically a couple of years where we had really good water quality because we didn't have a lot of rain, and then this huge slug of nutrients coming in from the storms, as well as other pollutants coming in there. So I don't, the draft water quality report card is not available yet. That's something that we put out early in the year once we have the full 12 months for the calendar year. But just to remind you, there's sort of two facets of that. There's the management component on the front side, and then the regulatory component on the back side. This group is primarily concerned with the regulatory component related to the chlorophyll thresholds. Nonetheless, the management components are still of interest because these are sort of alternative ways we can sort of address nutrient issues, or ways to think about them in the context of targets, chlorophyll, and light attenuation. So I'll start with the regulatory thresholds. Very simple. It's whether it's met or not, expressed as red or green. We have thresholds that are specific to each bay segment, as you know, Old Tampa Bay being 9.3. Don't know the other ones off the top of my head, but they do vary by bay segment based on sort of natural gradients along the bay. And if we look at the outcomes for the whole time series as well as this year, what we're seeing here is that we did meet the threshold in all bay segments for 2024. Again, we don't have December data at this point. The December values are based on the averages from the previous 5 years. But if you look at just the averages for the months we do have for all bay segments, we are meeting the threshold. And again, I do think that's largely a function of how the bay has been the previous couple of years, as a function of just less rainfall. We have a lot of sort of adaptive capacity for the system to accept or sort of assimilate these nutrient slugs from the storms. And I think that's just sort of a reflection of that in the regulatory outcomes here. Now, on the management side, this is a little more nuanced story here because, or in terms of how we assess it, it's not just yes, no, we've achieved the annual threshold. We have these 3 different outcomes of red, yellow, green that are meant to translate to some sort of management action of what we do moving forward based on the annual outcome. And it's not just whether or not the chlorophyll threshold was met, it also is related to light attenuation. So we have chlorophyll targets light attenuation targets, and there is a duration component as well. So these color categories do also consider what has happened in the previous 2 or 3 years relative to the current year. So a little more nuanced in how these outcomes are determined, but nonetheless does consider chlorophyll and light attenuation. Okay, so same thing here, long-term record of these outcomes by the major bay segments. Looking at 2024, it's sort of a similar story as the regulatory outcomes. Most of the bay segments are falling in that category we want to see. However, lower Tampa Bay, this was sort of a strange one for us, is now in the yellow category, which is our caution category. This is, if you remember the plots I showed, chlorophyll was pretty high in lower Tampa Bay, as well as light attenuation. So this was something that I did not expect. I do think a lot of these other bay segments, in particular Old Tampa Bay, are kind of right on the brink of breaching the criteria for going into a different category. But we still see, based on how we define this, they're falling in that stay the course category. And just one point about that stay the course, this is our recommended action coming out of this. I don't think that's necessarily the right language for this. I don't think we should stay the course for Old Tampa Bay as well as the other green segments, because as we know, Old Tampa Bay is a marginal system. We don't want to just do nothing, as we talked about, given what we think the bay might look like in the future. And also, again, going back to that idea that we are coming off very dry years. We have a lot of adaptive capacity in the system right now, or rather prior to the storms, that I think contributed to the conditions we're seeing this year in Old Tampa Bay of sort of still meeting the regulatory threshold and the sort of falling in this stay the course category. This is interesting too. This is basically whether or not the chlorophyll target was met by station in the major bay segments. And so you can see that even though, all three except for lower Tampa Bay were in the green, we do have a lot of big hits in terms of average chlorophyll. This right here for middle Tampa Bay, we typically don't see. This is basically a function of the water coming out of the Alafaya and sort of coming into middle Tampa Bay and mingling with the phytoplankton there. And we saw some pretty large blooms. Some pretty big hits in Old Tampa Bay. Again, I think this wasn't enough to drive it over the methods we use to bump it into that yellow category, but nonetheless, we are seeing sort of some signals of the effects of the storms at the annual scale. And again, these targets vary by bay segments, or the fact that these concentrations are overall fairly lower in lower Tampa Bay. There is a more stringent, or rather a lower target for lower Tampa Bay, because it's much less naturally productive than the upper bay segments. Here's light attenuation, kind of the same story. We see a lot more hits in lower Tampa Bay, big hits in upper Old Tampa Bay as well. But that gives you an idea of how that sort of shakes out in terms of the light environment. All right. Okay. So I want to sort of pivot now and talk about seagrasses. Even though I guess by the way we assess water quality attainment and the management outcomes, we are technically in the green for Old Tampa Bay. If you look at seagrass, it kind of tells a different story, that it sort of does suggest that this is still Old Tampa Bay is a system that is not where we want it to be. And this is coming from our annual transect data, or annual transect surveys that a lot of our partners help conduct. It's not the coverage data that we get from the district that is coming. The preliminary data we've seen from the district does suggest that this trend that we're seeing here is going to be similar for the bay segments if you look at the aerial maps. But point being here, this is just looking at frequency occurrence of all species, again, a different measure than aerial coverage or acreages. But the trend we see is that looking at 2023 to 2024, all but Old Tampa Bay increasing the overall frequency occurrence of all species. That's good. However, Old Tampa Bay did show a decline. Again, even though water quality was generally okay, we are still we are still seeing decreases in seagrasses. So again, something is not right in that base segment. Now, kind of just a fun thought exercise I went through, prompted by Ed. I wanted to look at SSOs, just because I know there was a lot of that going on with the storms. And it is also sort of a measure of what was driving some of the water quality changes we were seeing later in the year with chlorophyll and light attenuation. So I took it upon myself to dive into the DEP's public notice of pollution database. I know many of y'all are familiar with that, but that's sort of a community-driven database where, people can report spills or events that have happened. They can say, this is where it was, this is when it happened, this is, who I am, if you want to contact me about it. And then there's like a narrative description about what happened, including estimated volume of wastewater or, any sort of water mass released to the surrounding environment. The details of that are in that narrative description, and it looks a lot like this. This is just one example, not trying to call out whatever this particular report was. But if I wanted to look at sort of an estimate of how many gallons were reported this year, as well as historically, I had to sort of parse out the important numbers from this. And I would, if anybody's interested in that, I love to talk about that. I had this cool flow chart to show that, but figured you wouldn't care. Anyway, I was able to, I think with fairly high confidence, pull out from each one of these reports an estimated gallons of water that was released from each one of these events. And from that, I was able to reconstruct a history of basically SSOs in our region, kind of broke it out by the sub-watersheds in our overall Tampa Bay watershed. And this goes back to 2017. This database wasn't started till after 2016 when we had that sort of large storm event. Hermione came through and caused a lot of havoc with SSOs. That is our baseline for this. So looking at a previous report, the baseline for the 2016 SSOs in our region was it's actually just slight above 200 million gallons. So if you look at the scale here, this is 90 million gallons. So nowhere near that baseline, but still nonetheless, these are volumes that we know are not good for the Bay. 2024, if you look at that baseline, was the second highest year reported for volumes of discharge. Manatee River, we know what happened there. So a lot of SSO gallons reported there. Boca Ciega Bay, Hillsborough Bay, Old Tampa Bay, kind of across the board where we saw these things. And just to drive the point home that this was storm driven, this is a breakdown by month. You can kind of see really, not a whole lot happening until August. We had Debbie come through, and then huge numbers in October with Milton and Helene. So I just, not to sort of say, let's do more about SSOs. I think we should, but this is just kind of an example of, this is one factor that was likely driving the water quality additions we saw later in the year in Old Tampa Bay. So just to wrap up, all segments provisionally through November are meeting the regulatory thresholds. All segments are green for the management outcomes, except Lower Tampa Bay, high chlorophyll, high light attenuation in that Bay segment. Like I said, I think Old Tampa Bay, maybe some of the other Bay segments are right on that threshold of bumping right close to the threshold of bumping the threshold for chlorophyll. It's just that the way we assess it, it didn't quite breach that this year. We are coming off dry years, as I said. I think if we hadn't had 2 previous years being very dry, and even leading up to about August of this year, it was still very dry, we wouldn't have seen this outcome. So the ability of the Bay to assimilate these nutrients, particularly Old Tampa Bay, was pretty good, given the fact that we haven't had a lot of storm water coming into the system. The water clarity was pretty good. That being said, with these storms, who knows? Next year, we're sort of chewing away at some of that assimilative capacity now that we've had the storms come in and sort of inundate the Bay with with nutrients and other pollutants, we might see a different outcome next year. So just keep that in mind. The fact that we're still continuing to be in the green doesn't mean we're going to stay in the green. And it's more of a question too of like, do we think, this is a lot of conversation about Old Tampa Bay, but is Old Tampa Bay as a whole, is this an acceptable condition? We still kind of think that is a marginal bay segment that is not necessarily where we want it to be. Even though we are seeing green this year, we know that, some things are not quite right. Seagrass continue to decline there, other issues with FSOs coming in. This is really not where we want to be, and we don't want to do nothing. We just know it's going to be more challenging with stormwater loads increasing, as well as additional stressors related to climate change. It's going to sort of add another layer of complexity there. So that's what I got. This is the third year of our current RA period. Expect a similar update at the end of next year. Hopefully we're still in the green, but I don't know if I can promise that. So, all right. Any questions about that? All right. Oh, Chris has one. Oh, geez.
Hey guys, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm on the road, so you might be hearing some background noise. So yeah, Marcus, real quick, the SSOs, that I love those plots because that was a question I had, was the magnitude of the impact. But do we have an idea of what the concentrations might look like? I know we don't actually have data, but can we infer based on what we expect to see in that? It's not like raw sewage, like a lot of people believe that it's just raw sewage. That's not the case, but I do think it's really important that we get a better understanding of the speciation of nitrogen and phosphorus in that water. We've learned that in Sarasota Bay, where it matters what form of nitrogen is getting into the bay, if it's ammonia versus organic or inorganic. So I was just wondering if there's a way we might be able to tease that out.
Yeah, short answer is no. I can make some wild assumptions, but based on what I've seen in those narrative descriptions, that's information that's not provided. But you're absolutely right. Those reported gallons could be a lot of different types of water, I guess. It could be untreated wastewater or treated wastewater, or reuse water, or just like a mix. Yeah, it could be anything. So those gallons don't tell us a whole lot other than sheer volume. But I guess there is sort of an implicit assumption that there is some sort of load associated with that, because we know those do affect water quality at a general scale. I'm unable to dig any deeper than that. If we can, well, yeah, go ahead.
Are those reported SSOs? Is that an estimate of the amount of water that is discharged into the bay, or is that kind of like also discharged on the land surface?
It could be both. It just says this is how much we expected or we estimated to be released from this event, and oftentimes it says, oh, it went to a stormwater pond, or it was vacuumed up somehow, or it was directly released to the bay. That's a level of information that I possibly could pull out, but it's not, again, for this example, discriminated that way. So yeah, don't assume that the number of gallons that I'm showing here are direct to the bay, although at some level everything does flow to the bay. It's not like these are end of pipe gallons going to Old Tampa Bay, for example.
Marcus, if I could just add to that, I did the same exercise, by the way, at the request of someone in our company. I just want to put a couple caveats on the analysis of that data. To Chris's point, well, number one, you have an obligation to make that notification. You have to do it within 24 hours. You won't always have complete information when you put that record in.
Yeah.
So that's part of the problem. The other thing, as you already pointed out, is you may have a total volume. Some is to ground and recovered, some is to ground and not recovered. Some of it goes to maybe a retention pond, and they basically lime the area and walk away. And then some of it is actual surface water discharge. And it's really tough and time consuming to kind of parse through that when you're trying to do this analysis. So I think Chris's point is well taken. Maybe that's something we can do as a focused effort to say, okay, when you have a storm and you have a lift station that, you know, doesn't operate properly and it overfills and goes to ground, what does that water quality look like, right? Or if you've got a stormwater management system that is designed for a 25-year, 24-hour event and you happen to get 18 inches of rain in 9 hours, what does that water look like? Those are going to be very different in terms of water quality. So I'd be interested to hear how you did this. I threw it all in an AI. Asked it a lot.
Kind of what I did.
Okay.
Try to get correct with that.
Yeah, but I just want to say whenever, and I did put this caveat when I presented this to management. You know, kind of a general question as how did the storm regionally impact environmental resources? This is one of the things I put in front of them with the caveat that it was very difficult and you have to make some assumptions when you're.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like the easiest way for me to describe it to the media was, you know, we're still talking about measuring these in tens of millions of gallons, not hundreds of millions of gallons. And so while it's not ideal, it's not the worst that we've ever seen. I also just for like level setting, when 2015, 2016 happened and we had that 200+ million gallon SSO year, you know, we did seek formal guidance from DEP about whether or not we ought to be estimating a load associated with these SSO events. And the guidance was not to estimate a load associated with them because they are emergency discharges. So they're not going into the load estimation that we're calculating and reporting out there. But like Marcus said, it is still going to have some sort of influence on the water quality conditions and the chlorophyll A conditions that we observe. So it's kind of useful to have this course analysis with all of the caveats associated with it. But in case you didn't know that we've sort of been down this path with the load and how you're assessed.
Yeah.
I just wanted to be clear. about
No,
that.
it's a good point. So if you're somebody sitting at EPA headquarters looking at this document, I would think they would know we had really one tropical storm, 2 hurricanes impact the area, the region. You know, that context matters. So I don't know if that works its way into the RA update this year in some fashion, maybe just as a part of the narrative.
Yeah.
You know, I do think that's important context to add.
Yeah, where the data is available, it goes into the raw loading calculations if it's reported and that data is available, but as Maya mentioned, the decision memo passed and guidance from the regulators, it doesn't go towards an entity's compliance assessment. Because so they're excluded from the overall annual compliance list.
So mentioning that in some qualitative way, but not recognizing that our guidance is, you're not going to quantify those, I think is important backstory for this year's update.
I also want to plug for this group, you know, we have a grant program called the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund. And I think we recognize that there's still investments that are needed to improve the resilience of many of these pump stations, lift stations, smaller infrastructure. And if you're one of those entities that's looking at making those kinds of investments, I'd encourage you to look at the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund as a way to fund some of those resilience enhancements. I think that'll be a priority for the upcoming year. So, you know, plug that.
I took a little different approach to it, and I wanted to see what our citizens were being educated on. There were some articles in our local papers, and so I took that article that was published, and I actually made a copy for you, Marcus. It was published on October 16th of our millions of gallons of wastewater put into as a result of the hurricanes. As a collective, we did 92 million gallons. If you go through the report and you look and you do the numbers in the article, and then I teased it a little bit further and looked at Tampa, and Tampa did 8 million gallons. Collective was 92 as a region. So I just wanted to see where we stood as an SSO contributor. But this is all available to the public, it's published out there in newspapers, so the public's aware of this.
Yeah.
They know.
And I'm
they know
familiar with
it.
that article. I was using it as a backstop, see if my numbers weren't
So your numbers
wildly
are
wrong.
real close to this.
But
article.
if anybody's curious, I have been attempting to sort of parse it out by facility, because that is reported. I mean, obviously, if you're maintaining that facility, you have probably a good idea since you probably made the report, but I'm working on that information as well, if anybody wants it. I just didn't.
Now, if you want to dig even deeper, there's a 5-day written report that's required where it actually, it submits more information, either more gallons, less gallons, and sometimes if there's some analytical
Yeah.
results if that were taken there. So there is additional information for each of those discharges that were reported. It's just not on the website. It would be on the Oculus under each facility, so.
Okay. Noted.
Yeah, great point. I think the provision of the permits that people are reporting on has a 1,000-gallon threshold. You probably saw this. A lot of them were just reported as 1,000 gallons or more.
Not anymore. DEP has changed their mind on that. If it goes to surface water, it has to be reported.
They haven't changed the.
We got
rules, though.
chastised for not reporting
They haven't
less than
changed-
1,000
They
gallons.
haven't changed the rule, though.
Well, that's what I said
Yeah.
to them, was that's subjective, that it's a public harm because, and they said, no, it's not. If it goes to surface water, you have to report it. If it's a gallon, I guess.
Well, again, the point was,
Sorry.
it was a sore
point.
subject, sorry.
That's good to know, though.
At least in my analysis, I just used 1,000 gallon.
Yeah.
Not speculate that it was more or less than the original volume. So that's my point, that 100 million gallons might be 110, might be 90.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainty, but it tracks with the storm, so that made me feel good.
Yeah. What do you do with 20 inches of rain? That's the.
Where is that?
So the next item we'll move on to is some enhancement plans for the action plan database. Right?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to go through, after the next article on the addendum, so. My quite frequent requests over the decades were what source loading information.
Okay.
Hold on.
Better you than me.
It's frozen on me.
Okay, so as part of the,
Buy something now.
yeah, I'm gonna buy something. So as part of the upcoming spring contract, within the next RA update, we're doing a enhancement of the action plan database. Some of you are very familiar with the action plan database. Those of you who aren't, or consider yourself lucky, and maybe you will become familiar with it. We want to very quickly run through, like in the first few months of next year, run through this process to get input from both district program users and stakeholders in how to make the action plan database easier to use, to report your projects. We're specifically focused on nitrogen load reduction projects here, but for the other projects that you would include into the action plan database. As well as identify things, additional things that could be done beyond just this nitrogen load reduction input that may help you in the use of the action plan database to feel more comfortable going in and using it, entering your projects, keeping things up to date. When there will be a meeting which we have yet to schedule, sometime in early January. And we would like as many volunteers as possible from stakeholders who are interested in providing us input on their difficulties with the action plan database, what they'd like to see improved, how they'd like to be able to access it. Anything that you can get your input on is wanted and needed, as well as those who deal with it all the time. Mess with this thing constantly. There will be a beta version that we'll put out for testing. That'll be part of the initial crew who won't be able to test that either. That'll be available for everyone to get in and work through and decide what's good, what's bad, what needs to be fixed. And there is an accelerated schedule over, what we originally thought we'd do with the. In a perfect world, we want to move back and see how all that works, but ideally, we'll get through all this by the end of March or April or so. And actually have a new action plan database that's ready to use and is much more comfortable for all users concerned. We'll see how that goes. For any of those of you who are interested in being part of the stakeholder group who's meeting with us, please let Maya know. To be honest with you, let Maya know, and then we can get working on putting a date together as to when we can all get together with my technical guys on our team and this program, and you all, so we can get a discussion, sit down.
5 volunteers. That's kind of level.
Okay.
My only comment on this is that we are also receiving emails from the FDP business portal. So we have to input every January. Our deadline, I just got an email on about it's January 15th. To any of our BMAP projects that we have. Just make it very similar to the business portal.
That's the plan.
Please do not make it similar to the business.
And having to learn the whole because I'm sending lists to 4 different agencies.
We talked with Anita about this.
And getting access to our data, because I know that heartburn about getting access to this, and I don't see the issue with that. This is a DP reasonable assurance, and yet they're requiring this for our BMAPs. Should all be accessible to Tampa Bay Estuary Program. I don't see why he is being not able to look at these.
The challenges has been an issue going on for quite some time, for over several iterations. And it does not appear that he's going to abandon their spreadsheet tool. And the challenge for us is we're bigger than just the Alafaya, the Hillsborough, and the Manatee River BMAPs. And so it's very hard for us to avoid, we could provide them information, or they could tap into ours, but not as much vice versa. We've already got Tiffany committed to being one of the stakeholders to look at how we can improve sort of the cross talk between what they're asking for and what we're asking for. We understand that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But it's a good point. Thank you for making sure everyone's aware of that.
Good. Second part of this, we also, as part of this work, the next update, it's time to get the domestic industrial wastewater loads information in so that we can start with our monthly loading time series from all the facilities, from all the sources. You may recall, those of you who have been lucky enough to receive emails from me over the last couple of decades, requesting your loading information, typically straight from your DMRs, but I send you a spreadsheet that you provided me previously. I send it back to you again. I send it to something on the order of 75 or more different individuals and facilities. And then you send it back to me, and I cajole you along over a period of several months. Marcus has done us all a favor, we hope, and put all this up on the Estuary Program website. Little spreadsheets, anything that access it. You put your data in there, say it's done, and then I don't have to worry about bugging you. We need to get the 22 and 23 data in by early March. The 24 data, I don't have to have it early March. If you have it ready, that's a great way. So now doing it, get it all in one time, that's perfect. But I do have to have it in the next couple of months. So that's my ask. It's kind of a quicker timeline than we normally do, but we're anxious to get going on this. I know the 22 and 23 data are already around. Some of you I know have already gone into the website and filled in their information, and some have already sent it to me because they have it on their calendars. After every New Year's Day, they come into the office and they see send information to Ray, and they do. But that's very few and far between. If you need guidance on how to get there, there's point source reporting tools on it, because you get there through the consortium webpage. You click on it and you pop right into this nice spreadsheet. And you can get there and enter all your information. If you have problems with that, call me. Or. Marcus. No. Yeah, but bug me. I'm also happy to send you the spreadsheets you sent me last time too. It's not a hassle. I've got them all stashed away. So we want to keep running it that way. I'm happy to email and have conversations with each of y'all individually, because that's kind of a fun part of it. All right, anyways, I get to catch up with everybody. So that's what I wanted to spend this time requesting from y'all this meeting.
That's right.
That's all I got.
Any
I need from
questions?
y'all.
All right, thank you, Ray. And then Ed, we have an open discussion item here, new sources, unassigned allocations, and small sources update and transfers. You have here, this is a future FDP agenda item.
Yeah, these are again, conversations that we've had through consortium that not become the basis for a decision memo, but there have been points of discussion at our consortium meetings. We've heard from a couple of new sources that are being developed in the Hillsborough Bay watershed. Not sure where that's at in terms of these process of approval, but had conversations with the Southwest District. You know where the consortium standpoint is in terms of, you know, no allocations being available in that base segment. So that's on everyone's radar. We need to also, during this RA cycle, look at updating small sources. Again, we've relied on the information for that. In each of the base segments of existing small sources that fall below the allocation thresholds that had been previously defined. Been ongoing conversations about the need to look at allocation based on jurisdictional changes and land use changes within the watershed. These are all topics that have been a discussion of the consortium. I'm not placing them on the table at this standpoint, and I'm just reminding all the participants that during this RA cycle, if we need to develop a specific recommendation for those items, you know, this is the time to have those discussions and move forward with them. I feel like y'all are glazing over with some of these topic areas at this point. So I'm not going to belabor the point until it becomes an issue. I think for some entities, you guys are having difficulty of looking at meeting permitting conditions. It's usually not an issue, or we're not meeting water quality conditions. But you know, these are things that the supporting participants need to weigh. Future planning for submitting an RA document to DEP. Again, that's going to be due at the end of 2027. So we know things have changed over the past 15 years within the watershed. We're still sort of on the path forward for the majority of the space segment, but we know that jurisdictions have expanded, land uses have changed, hydrologic conditions are changing. So if we need to make changes during these RA cycle updates, these are the times to have those discussions amongst the participants. So I'll stop there. If you guys had questions on any of those items, take them. If we want to raise them to an agenda item at the next consortium meeting, we're happy to do that as well. But I think most of these discussions have died, you know, over the past several years, just because we've had good water quality, with the exception of Old Tampa Bay. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Anything else we want to add to this?
All right, last item here for discussion, proposed 2025 meeting schedule. First of which here is February 26th. Still what we want to go with?
People. Yeah, Ashley likes the 26th.
That works.
Wednesdays and Fridays are like the days that still work. Seems like those are the days that typically work together. And
Fridays are better than
Wednesdays are better.
That's it.
All right, with that, we'll call the meeting to adjournment. Everybody have a great holiday season and I hope you get time with friends and family. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.